You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the special interview show. I am incredibly blessed tonight. I'm joined by two amazing men in the studio tonight. First up is the lovely Andy Mercer. Good evening, Andy. How are you?
Hello. You're blessed, are you, dear? That sounds a bit worrying. I'm not too bad. Had an early start today and I'm a bit half asleep while my wife was volunteering for the marathon, not running it. She works for a charity and they had the people out sort of calling out and sort of wishing people doing well. And we was up about 7 o'clock this morning, which is not good for me and the best of any day of the week, but Sunday especially. So I'm like, oh my God, slowly melting away. Otherwise, not too bad.
Well, that's okay. I'm glad you're with me tonight.
I am here.
We are interviewing an incredible person tonight. His name is Mark Norman. Now, he is a folklore writer and podcaster in his own right. He does the Folklore podcast. He's written books. He is published in a wide variety of magazines and websites. And he is a leading authority in folklore in the West Country. Good evening, Mark. How are you?
Hello, Kerry. I'm very well, thank you.
I'm so pleased you're joining us tonight. I've been waiting to talk to you for quite a while now, and I'm so very happy that you've managed to.
No problem. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Now, let's start. First of all, let's talk about what is folklore, Mark. What is your take on folklore?
Well, folklore really... It can be broken down into something that's quite simple. I mean, there are lots of different ways of looking at folklore. You can look at folklore as being an academic discipline in some cases. You can look at folklore as being something that we can study. But the simplest way of breaking it down is to split the word in half. Because when the term folklore was first coined in the 19th century, by a gentleman called William Toms. He was the first person to use the term. That was back in 1846. Originally, the term was hyphenated, folk-law. Mm-hmm. And that's the way to break it down. So folklore is broken into two parts. Law, meaning beliefs or customs or traditions, and folk, meaning people, us. So folklore is the beliefs or the traditions of any group or subset of people.
That's a fair enough point. So where do you stand on this? Are you out there to prove the various folklore that's out there, or are you just out there just to record it? Where do you stand with that?
Well, any good folklorist should not be looking to prove or disprove anything, in my opinion. This is where we need to make quite a clear divide between the role of a folklorist and the role of a paranormal investigator, say, or a paranormal researcher. Now, for a paranormal investigator, which I have done, but I am not, for a paranormal investigator, you are looking to try and provide scientific evidence to prove or disprove a particular phenomena. So that might be a haunting, it might be a cryptid of some kind, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, Chupacabras, whatever you like. It could be one of a number of things, but for a paranormal investigator, you're looking to set out to try and collect evidence that will conclusively prove or disprove a particular thing. For a folklorist, that's not what we're interested in. So if you take ghosts as an example, as a folklorist, I do not care particularly whether ghosts exist or do not exist as an apparition, a paranormal piece of phenomena. That's not what is important. For a folklorist, what is important is why people report the things that they report, why they see certain things, how those things affect them, and how they change over time. Because folklore is really all about looking at particular events as symbols. So symbolism is very important within folklore. So you are looking at a particular ghost, for example, say it's a headless horseman. Mm-hmm. We're not interested as folklorists as saying, okay, there is a headless horseman. We're going to prove that that is an apparition of a horseman who was once living and is now deceased and has come back from the spirit realm. That's not what we're about doing. We're looking at that and saying lots of people experience this particular thing on this road where they see a headless horseman. Why? Why do they see it in this spot? What bearing does that have on the location in history? And how have these reports changed over time? Do we have examples of people from different cultures, for example, seeing the same thing and interpreting it in different ways? Because the interpretation of symbols is very much dependent on the culture from which you come, and that changes over time too. Mm-hmm. So we're interested in why reports happen, why people say that a particular thing has happened, and whether that has been the case for X hundred years, or whether, for example, people used to see a phantom coach and now they see a phantom motor car or something like that because things have changed and developed over time, or a story has been added to over time. So you could have a story that started off being quite simple. There was a ghost of a man who used to be a market trader, for example. And then other things happen and people add to that. Oh, yes, he was a market trader, but, he came from a very bad family. That may or may not be true. Mm-hmm. And then that gets adopted into the story, and then the story develops, and then another bit gets added over time, and so on. So through oral transmission, which is the way that folklore stories would originally have been passed from person to person, these stories change and develop, and we're looking at why that happens and what are the interesting tropes or motifs within those stories that develop over time.
Okay, so when you get a case come in, do you then break it down and look back over the history, or do you start from a historic point of view and move forward? Which way do you work? Do you sort of work from now backwards, or from backwards forwards, as it were?
I'll always try and work backwards if it's a modern report, or if it's an old piece of folklore, then I might go in the other direction. It really depends on what it is. So if somebody highlights an experience that they've had quite recently, and it has particular elements to it that are familiar, they might not be familiar in a particular location necessarily, but they might be familiar for other reasons, then I'll go back through other stories to look for similar things that have happened and try and tie it in that way. If somebody says, oh, did you know that something used to happen 200 years ago in this graveyard, for example, then I'll look at what's happened since then and whether there are other stories of a similar kind or even a different kind. So it really depends on what it is. It can go in either direction. History is important because folklore, of course, is all about what is happening around us and what happens within communities and to people. So it's really a subset of history, looking at social history in a lot of ways.
Andy?
I was going to go back to something Mark was saying there about the adaptation and development and the way stories and folklore change, going from the Phantom Horseman to the Phantom Car. If you remember, something we're going to talk about a bit later on, I think, also, but if you remember, Kerry, last week we were talking about the old hag syndrome and dreaming. We were saying before, Mark, that previously people used to describe things like the old hag, a witch creature, but now some people who are interested in science fiction talk about alien abductions and aliens in their bedroom. So it's the same kind of thing where it's developed over time and becomes something slightly different according to the culture and ideas of the time, the way these things do change and transform. So I think something we'll come back to a bit later on, but it just suddenly struck me that was exactly what we were talking about last week when we were talking about the old hag syndrome and hypnagogic dreaming with incubus and succubus. So it fits in what you were just talking about there.
Yeah, absolutely, that is the case. And I've looked on my own podcast at incubi and succubi and the whole sleep paralysis phenomena. And yes, of course it does. People interpret it in different ways. So we find within different areas of folklore examples of sleep paralysis as a medical condition that have different tropes attached to them. So yes, the incubus and the succubus, the demon or the supernatural creature that sits on your chest, comes out of very early history, medieval times and before, because sleep paralysis at the end of the day is a known medical condition. Within medical circles, it's still often referred to as old hag syndrome because of the nature of the history and the folklore surrounding it. In medieval times, in early history or early modern history, where people were a lot more superstitious and a lot more religious in many ways, they would not have understood what was happening to the body as part of this medical condition. So it is natural to assume that it is some kind of demonic intervention. But then as different pieces of superstition and lore become prevalent over time, that can change. So old hag comes out of, obviously, witch lore and stories of witches sitting on people's chests and hampering their breathing. We find it then as we come into more modern times, as you say, with alien abduction stories. Aliens play quite a big role, and we'll probably cover this later on, I would imagine, in another area of folklore, and that's the similarities between alien abduction stories and fairy lore. Yeah. And there are some very, very marked similarities there as well. And it is a case of people's experiences being quite genuine. And as I say, it's not my role to say that any paranormal or superstitious, supernatural, unusual phenomena, whatever it is something that is, whether it exists or not, it's not my role. And I certainly don't set out to try and disprove or prove any of these things. It's to look at how traditions and experiences come together over time. So for something like sleep paralysis, yes, you'll find it with alien abduction stories, you'll find it with witchcraft themes, you'll find it with spirit possession. They're all very, very similar, and they draw on different aspects of culture.
Absolutely. I think there's an important role that folklorists play in the sense of identifying the longer history of something and the development of an idea. I mean, one of the things you talked about a lot last week in the show was, I'm a psychotherapist by profession. I've dealt with people who've experienced these kind of actual experiences and explained to them, you're dealing with a psychological phenomenon, not supernatural. But, people who don't have the knowledge of the past, of the different kinds of ways it appears to manifest, will straight away jump to the idea, this must be a real phenomenon because I experience it in the way I'm described. And I'll say to them, there's a history of these kinds of things occurring through centuries. And as I say, things develop. We also did talk, funny enough, about the idea of abductions and then the fairies taking people into the underground world and the creatures of that nature over history that kind of tie in with that same thing of these things that develop over time. And there is a greater history to these things. Yeah, that's some fascinating stuff.
Yes, it absolutely is. And the links between alien abduction experiences and the experiences over time, not just historic, mainly historic, but also more modern in some cases, of people who report experiences where they're taken to the fairy realm, or there is some kind of example of being pixie-led or a loss of a passage of time that they account for in that way. the tropes are very, very similar. And you're looking at big ones like the descriptions. Obviously, if you take the description of a typical grey alien or something similar, almond-shaped eyes, very thin body, largish head, you find, if you look into the old Victorian fairy artwork archives, lots and lots of very, very similar representations of fairies in that way. Spacecraft descriptions and drawings versus the fact that fairies were often reported as travelling on discs of light, like flying discs. There are quite a lot of similarities there. The loss of the passage of time is quite common. Alien-human hybridization also ties in with the fairy realm and the coming together of humans and fairies very well. And then it comes down to even very, very small things, like some people who report being abducted by aliens report a very, very earthy smell. And again, we find in reports of people who are taken to the fairy realm something very similar, a smell a bit like cinnamon. So these very, very small details often come out in these stories as well, and show how these tropes, these motifs, develop and move across the stories over time.
Absolutely, and that is, as I say, that's the fascinating part, that often people who investigate things like alien abduction stories don't have the knowledge of the previous versions, if you like, the previous experiences and previous stories and tales that you find, say, in folklore mythology, of these kinds of experiences that do definitely parallel the idea of spacecraft taking people off to other worlds and those sort of examinations, and you said down to things like strange smells that are similar in nature to those described previously. So it's important. That's why a folklorist's role, I think, is very important, because it shows the bigger picture and gives a more of a background to these experiences. I shall hand back to Kerry. Sorry, Kerry, I've kind of taken over again, which I tend to do. Sorry.
I know, I have to slap him occasionally, Mark, just to shut him up.
She gets very violent.
And we have actually already, we've had a question in the chat room. Richard has said, going back to the classic hauntings of the Phantom Stagecoach and Headless Horseman, a lot of these stories seem to be connected with water. The coach and horses will ride into a lake or a river. And he wants to know what you think about that and what the connection might be.
Yes, that is very much the case. There was a study of phantom coaches that was undertaken in the 1930s by a folklorist called Edward Waring, and the results of this were published in Folklore, the Journal of the Folklore Society, in the 1930s, and it started to try and record and map in quite a small way phantom coach stories throughout the UK. And he actually made that very point, that a lot of these stories do end up with the coach being driven into water, or for them being some kind of accident in some way, and the coach ending up in water. What the significance of that is, you could argue a number of things, I guess. It's certainly a very, very strong trope, because if you've read, for example, The Woman in Black, Susan Hill's ghost story, we have the whole thing about Eelmarsh House being in the middle of a piece of marshland where the road gets covered by water and the house is only accessible at certain times of the day, and you get the sound of coaches and coach and horses and this coach crash. And spoilers, I won't go too far into it, but that trope obviously carries across very strongly into that. We find the same thing as well with black dog stories, actually, that there have been suggestions that a lot of the black dog stories that come out of the north of England, where the dog is more portentous or more ominous, are kind of connected to waterways. And there's an argument that says that is because the law travelled into the UK from Scandinavia via the Vikings, for example. I don't hold particularly with that theory. I do address it in my book to a certain extent, but I think that's not actually the case. It's a bit of a red herring, that one. But water is certainly very important. There's a lot of folklore surrounding waterways and bridges, for example, you often find within folklore where a new bridge is built over a river that the folklore says that the devil will take the first soul that crosses the bridge, so therefore they would drive an animal over the bridge before any people crossed it to make sure that the first soul that was taken to hell was not a human one. So the role of water is quite strong within folklore generally. In the case of phantom coach stories, I think it's very much specific to the actual type of story that it is and whether the story involves a particularly sticky end, for example, or some other piece of strong folklore. Often it will be mapped onto something that happened earlier, so there might have been a particular event that led to a loss of life at a watercourse. It might go back into history and be some kind of battle or something even that comes from that area. And often we find with hauntings that there is an earlier story in history that the haunting is then mapped onto for some reason, and it kind of changes and develops over time in that way. So yes, the role of water is certainly important, but it's not important for one specific reason. It really would depend on the story that you are looking at.
Okay. Oh, it's interesting because I understand that water can hold a memory. So I was wondering if there might be a link there because it holds a memory. It might be almost like a water stone tape theory kind of situation there.
Well, that is an interesting theory, certainly, but I think it would depend on what you're looking at with a particular body of water. For example, there are lots of bottomless pool legends within folklore. Mm-hmm. And ghosts are often connected to these ponds or pools, which are often said to be bottomless. And that theory would hold fine in that case, perhaps, where you could argue that the water in a deep pool has been stagnant for a long time. Mm-hmm. But if you're looking at a running river or a watercourse, then the movement of water would dictate that if the water did indeed hold a memory, it would not stay in one particular location necessarily. Yeah. So I think it would depend on the type of story that you're looking at.
Yeah, I see your point on that one. I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about the importance of symbolism. I work in regards to crystals, and symbolism is really important in regards to crystal gridding. But in folklore, it's incredibly important, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly can be very, very important, because within folklore, you're looking at the way that people understand an experience that they have. So where you're dealing with symbolism in this case, which is slightly different to the way that you would deal with it with your crystal work, within somebody's particular experience within the realms of folklore, you're looking at how they interpret a symbol against a set of known comparators within their culture or across time. Because to understand a symbol, mm-hmm. you need to decode it. So, for example, if you go out and you see a big hole in the ground, and next to that is a sign with a man with a shovel in a pile of dirt, you understand, because you know how to decode that symbol, that sign is saying that there are roadworks there. Now, if you took that sign and you took it to the Amazon rainforest, then people would not be able to necessarily decode that sign in the same way. The closest you might get is if they'd seen any part of Western culture, they might assume it was somebody trying to put up a big umbrella because of the rain. Yeah, because that's what roadworks symbol looks like. But you take that sign to another culture and they will decode it in a different way, possibly depending on what they understand about the world around them. So within folklore, we're looking at any particular trope as a symbol, and we're looking at how people understand that symbol and how they decode it against the world around them, against their religious beliefs, perhaps, against the history of the area that they know, or any one of a number of different things. And that decoding of symbolism in that sense is probably slightly different to how you would work with symbolism within your crystal work.
Oh, I see. So sometimes that decoding must be very tricky when you're looking at cross-cultural differences.
Well, it is very tricky, but it's also very interesting, because that's part of what is fascinating, is where you find a story that has very, very similar elements to it in different cultures around the world, or in different parts of your country or any other country, and that is decoded in ways. So, for example, within the folklore that I have worked with a lot, so that's looking at apparitions of black dogs, spectral hounds within folklore. There are lots of recurring themes within stories that are very important. And to take one of those as an example, there is the fact that a lot of black dogs are reported to have very large eyes. Now, over time, there have been recurring descriptions of these eyes, and different terms are used, and one of the most common is that the dog has eyes like saucers. So what they're talking about is the fact that the dog's eyes are very large looking and very round, for example, like disc-like. Now, we find that in literature, because if you look at Hans Christian Andersen's Magic Tinderbox, then you'll find that the dog that guards the treasure in that story, the dogs that guard the treasure in that story, get progressively bigger as the story goes through, and their eyes get bigger, and they end up being eyes like saucers or eyes like discs. In Latin America, we find folklore of a similar nature surrounding spectral dogs. It's not exactly the same as in the UK. They tend to be two strains in Latin America. The dogs might be black or they might be white, one being more diabolic and the other not. But we find a similar pattern there, where the eyes are very significant in these animals, so they're quite large. And when we look at stories of the Latin American ghostly dogs, which are called Cadejo, then we see that people describe the eyes in a very similar way, but they say that the dogs have eyes like tortillas. They mean the same thing. The dog's eyes are round and they're large, but they're using their own cultural reference to describe the same thing. So we say that the dog's eyes are like saucers because saucers are very common within UK descriptions of things that we would understand the meaning of. And in Latin America, they have this very similar phrase, but they say that the dog's eyes has eyes like tortillas because that's something that is large and round and familiar within their culture.
I see. That's actually really quite interesting that they call it a tortilla and we call it a saucer. I actually find that quite fascinating. Rather
it's
than just large round eyes, you know what I mean?
It's the reference point, isn't it?
It's just a reference point, isn't it?
That's exactly what it is, yeah.
It is. So this perception of the phenomena or experience, whatever way you wish to describe it, there is that evolution, isn't there? We've talked about this before, haven't we, Andy, where there's this evolution through, the cultures and the times, and it's incredibly interesting when you start seeing it on just about every level, from hauntings through to, like you say, abductions to fairies to witchcraft. There is this evolution that you see. Even religion does this, doesn't it?
Of course it does, yes. Yeah. And don't forget, we've just been past Easter.
Yeah.
When we all have to put up with these horrendously inaccurate Facebook memes about where the word Easter comes from.
Oh, you love it. You got to love it.
Yeah, it changes and it develops over time. And yes, absolutely, the Christian religion does draw on a lot of pagan themes for its symbolism and for its important religious festivals and ceremonies, etc., etc. But just because everybody posts nice, attractive memes with pictures of Egyptian gods and things on them telling you where the word Easter comes from, don't believe everything 100% because it's not always the case.
But this is where your research comes in, isn't it, Mark?
It is, but this is also where the role of folklore is really, really important, because in 100 years' time, people might be taking that as the gospel truth because of the way that that story has been transmitted over time and believed in. And things enter into folklore and become very, very strong. And the very first edition of my podcast that I did, which people can still listen to because it's all still available on the website. The very, very first one that I did was an interview with an American researcher called Andrea Kitter. And she's an expert on, she's an expert on a number of things, but she's an expert on the development of the phenomena surrounding Slender Man.
We were going to get into this one, Mark.
So Slender Man, we can trace the history of Slender Man very, very easily. We know who created Slender Man. We know when it was created. We know where it was created. But if you look at what's happened since then, there is now quite a wide field of younger people coming through who are not familiar with the roots of the Slender Man legend because they weren't around at the time, who are now uncertain about the history of Slender Man and where it comes from. So it takes on more of a supernatural theme. We have cases like that, the really, really unfortunate case in Wisconsin, wasn't it, I think, with the Slender Man stabbings, for example, where two girls stab another schoolgirl. Thankfully, she doesn't die because they believe that they were told to do it by Slender Man. So this motif of Slender Man then starts to enter into our culture, enter into folklore, and the edges become blurred. We lose this kind of starting point of saying, oh yeah, well it was invented. This is when it happened. It was on creepypasta, etc., etc. And now it becomes a case of people report sightings of Slender Man, and the whole kind of symbolism moves on a pace and becomes more blurred. And further down the line, we start to lose that origin point altogether. So with something like Slender Man, we're very fortunate as folklorists because we can pinpoint where it enters into folklore and track it through, which is really, really unusual. We don't have that luxury very often.
Funny enough, I can actually give you an example, a direct example where the Slender Man mythology or folklore has taken over in an actual haunting that occurs. I've investigated a place called Woodchester Mansion many, many times back in the early 2000s.
In Gloucester?
Yep, that's the place, yeah.
Yep,
Rather very unique building, isn't it, Mark? It was a Victorian but never finished, and it's got lots of stories to it. But one particular story of a ghostly experience that I had and a number of people had in the early 2000s, i.e. before the invention of Slender Man, was of a tall, dark figure in the rear corridor, which is the little section where part of it is the old Spring House, the previous building. If you're standing facing the back door behind you, the wall to your left, right rather, that goes into the hillside, that wall and floor is the last bit that's left of Spring House, and this figure had been seen there. Now this is from about 2001 onwards. I was in the second ever investigation that took place there with the Ghost Club. It was never called anything other than it's just this tall dark figure people were seeing down there. Recently I've heard two different people say, oh yes, you mean the Slender Man in Woodchester. And I had to pause for a second and thought, hang on a minute, so it's now been renamed the Slender Man of Woodchester by at least two people who aren't connected to each other. And I was really quite taken aback by that. I thought, actually, no, it's nothing to do with the created creepypasta story of Slender Man. And one of them was like, oh, okay, fair enough. But it was just amazing, by the way. So?
That's a really good example, though, isn't it? Because you've got something that is now going to become... the edges of that are going to become more and more blurred over time, and then eventually that link will be lost altogether, and the Slender Man figure will become the official name for whatever that particular piece of phenomena is.
It's quite worrying in some respects if that is going to be the future of folklore and mythology, that things can be invented and forgotten about, the invention thereof, and become seen as a real phenomenon. And that makes you wonder, if you go backwards to some early folklore, have some of those things being deliberately created by storytellers of the past, rather than collecting things like folklore and mythologies and stories, that they've actually invented them themselves and then made out that they are genuine and spread them around. It's
it's interesting and very difficult to track. There will be an interview on the Folklore podcast within the next month, looking at. I'm not going to say what it's looking at. People will have to listen and find out. But it is with a leading. It's with
Teaser.
a leading. It's with a leading American, very very well respected American researcher in the field of investigation, who looks at one particular piece of phenomena that we're covering in some detail. And in particular looks at the fact that this creature, that's as much as I'm going to say, it is a creature. This creature that is reported now, the description of it originally was completely different, and it changed at a key point, which he has tracked exactly what that key point is, where the description of this creature changes from one type to another. And that's a very, very good example.
That sounds absolutely fascinating.
It does. When's that going to be released, Mark?
Yeah.
It will be the guest interview episode of the next podcast that comes out. Where are we now? We're in April at the moment.
Yeah.
So the 1st of May will be my next one. So it'll be the 15th of May will be the next interview episode that comes out, and it will be in that one.
Excellent.
Okay,
We shall listen to
guys, if you want to catch that is at www.thefolklorepodcast.com. And trust me, all of Mark's episodes are on there, and I have listened to quite a few, and they are absolutely fascinating. Really, really interesting to listen to. So on the 15th of May, yeah?
Yes, absolutely.
15th of May, catch that one, because I'm going to be tuning into that, that's for sure. Anyway, back to you. How did you actually get into this field? I mean, I'm really interested where you started in this field, because you know so much information. Where did you first start?
Well, I've been interested in the field for a long time, and to a certain extent, we can go back and we can blame Bob Rickard and Paul Sivking, because it really came out of the early editions of the Fortean Times. I guess that I was really interested in the unexplained, let's say, as a wider field. But by the same token, I was particularly interested in those kinds of stories that we might look at as being Fortean, to look at a broader term, but within my own area where I tended to live and work. So the local history and folklore side became more of interest to me, perhaps. I mean, I used to I was a contributor to the Fortean Times, and I wrote book reviews and things for the Fortean Times, and it continues to be a great publication, but my area of interest and work kind of moved in a slightly more focused direction then. So I started to trace through a lot of these local myths and legends, and from that I started to become very interested in the way that we can look at these stories in other parts of the country and go, hey, do you know what, that's actually quite similar to what happens down the road. Why would that be the case? And then it moved from there, I guess, and I do a lot of work. I'm a committee member of the Folklore Society, so I do a lot of work in that area now, and do quite a lot of public speaking, I guess, on it as well. So I do quite a lot of large conferences and things looking at these things, because I enjoy presenting this evidence to other people, which is why I do a lot of writing, which is why I have the podcast, because I like to share this with other people. So, you know, I did quite a number of talks on a local level, and still do, in fact, for kind of local history societies and people like that. And the more I did then of those sorts of things, the more I listened to other people's research in these areas and got talking to them. And it really kind of just developed from there, I guess. So I didn't go... A lot of people go into this via the academic route.
Yeah.
I didn't go that way because my original field of study was actually in television production. So I originally used to work in the media industry and still do, I guess, in some ways. So I didn't go in with that academic background. I have a degree in social science, but not academic folklore. That is very, very important in a lot of ways. But to me, I like working on an independent level where I can pick and choose what I want to work on and how I want to present it. So if I want to do a podcast on something, I'll do it. If I think, do you know what, that's quite a big area of research, I'm going to write a book, then I'll write a book. I write for other people's websites occasionally when they cajole me into doing so, and various other bits and pieces, and I like to be able to pick and choose what I want to do.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that you looked very, very heavily into was the black dog folklore, wasn't it? Because you actually wrote a book on that.
Yes, my last book was on black dog folklore, that's right.
Okay. So what first piqued your interest in regards to the black dog?
Well, that was accidental, as these things often are. So I was looking at various bits of local folklore, and in particular I was looking at ghost stories at one point. This was in the late 1990s, and going back in time to the 1950s, 1960s, maybe even slightly earlier, there were within the UK a number of people who were very, very heavily involved in collecting folklore. Part of the art of being a good folklorist is to collect and record stories and traditions. And we were lucky in the mid 20th century. We had people who did an awful lot of that. One of whom was a lady called Theo Brown. Now, Theo lived not far away from where I live now, actually. She lived in the Exeter area. She was a research fellow at Exeter University, in fact, later in life. And she collected a lot of folklore on a wide range of subjects from all around the UK. She, again, like myself, she did a lot of work with the Folklore Society, where she was president and secretary for many years of different organisations. Now, when she passed away, all of her notes were bequeathed to the special collections in Exeter University Library. And I had gone in there to access her notes. And the reason that I'd done that was because I was looking for interesting local ghost stories that I hadn't come across before. And she has quite a lot in her collection. I thought, I'll just go and have a look and see what I can find. So I went in and I was going through all of her papers at some point. And this was in the very early days when they had not long been bequeathed to the university and before they were properly archived. And they were still in all the original boxes and things that they had travelled from Theo's house to the university. So they were still stored in like cardboard crisp boxes and things like that. And I came across this big blue metal tin. It was an ammunition tin, actually, old army ammunition tin. And it was labelled Black Dogs. And I thought, that's interesting. It's a tin full of dogs, whatever. I'll have a look and see what it actually is. So I had a look at the papers in there, and it was Theo's collection of stories relating to apparitions of ghostly black dogs. Now, there were three collectors of folklore in the UK, really, in the 20th century who were very heavily involved in collecting black dog stories. Theo was one of those. She'd written a really well-known article on the subject for the Folklore Journal in 1959, I think it was. And all of her research, all of her collection was in this tin. But also in this tin were three draft copies of a manuscript for a book on the subject, which everybody had wanted her to write because she was the leading collector really in this field. But she had worked on and changed and worked on again and never actually brought to publication. She eventually, in later life, she'd suffered a stroke and she couldn't work anymore on it. So it never came to publication. But we tracked down her literary executor, who was another very well-known folklorist, and I spoke to her about it, and she said it really should have been published, but never was. So I got permission from her literary executor to work on the archive and to see if we could to bring this to publication. As I worked through her manuscripts and worked through her collection, it became clear that it was going to need an awful lot of work to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. The 3 manuscripts, they were all very, very different in the particular areas that they covered. Obviously, the content only went up to the kind of 1960s, 1970s in the main. So there was a lot missing between then and now. The language was quite dated because a lot of it was written in the 1960s and 70s originally, and then had been worked on since then. And it wasn't in a state where it could happily be published as it was. So I gradually worked on the archive, and I transcribed everything that was in there relating to this field, and started to work through the manuscripts, and started to rewrite sections, and then started to write my own bits to supplement what Theo had originally written. And it kind of grew from there. But then when people learned that that was what I was doing, there started to be a lot more interest in it, and I'd started to give talks on it and things like that. And I started to receive new stories and experiences from people. And as time went on, my own archive then grew and continued to grow, and it never really stopped. I spoke to a gentleman in the north of England who runs, or in East Anglia, sorry, who runs a website called Shuckland. Hidden East Anglia is the full website, and it's part of that. A guy called Mike Burgess, and he gave me a lot of the stuff that he'd collected from that area. Janet Board, who a lot of people will know through her writing with her husband Colin, have written lots of kind of seminal books on Fortean subjects, alien animals, for example, being a particularly well-known one. Janet used to research the black dog quite heavily and had a very, very large archive. And I spoke to her, and she'd really stopped working on it because she had changed her focus to work on another subject. So she donated her archive to me, and I incorporated that into what I've got. So as far as we know now, the largest archive of this, of collected material, traditions, eyewitness accounts, sightings and other things on this subject is what I have stored here. There are some other researchers in the field that work within the UK, particularly Simon Sherwood and Bob Trubshaw, who brought out a book called Explore Phantom Black Dogs, which is kind of a collection of essays on the subject. And Jeremy Hart, who contributed to that, had a lot of collections. Jeremy gave me all his research as well to combine with everything. So I now have what is, as far as we know, the UK's largest archive of recorded sightings and traditions to do with this. So a lot of that features in the book, because the book is split into 2 parts. The first part is a study on the subject itself, and then the second part is a kind of gazetteer of 750 of the sightings from within my archive, just as like one line entries broken down across the country by county.
Well, fantastic. Now the link for so you can go and buy that book is actually in the chat room now. Andy has kindly posted the link for it in there. Now, could you just explain to me exactly what the black dog, sorry, I was reading blog at the same time, black dog phenomenon actually is? Because I believed it was a forerunner to a bad omen. It was like a bad omen thing, really, is where I'm going with that.
Yeah, no, well, you're right. But you're only right in some parts of the country, or in some in some stories. So the apparition of a ghostly black dog can mean a number of different things, and it can mean different things depending geographically where you are or what the behaviour of the dog is, a number of different elements. So, for example, in the north of England, where the dog tends to be known, well, it's known by a number of names, but most people would know Shuck or Barguest as the two particular naming variants of the black dog. In those cases, yes, it is said to be ominous, it's said to be portentous. It can be a precursor to bad luck or death or a number of other things. But in other areas of the country, it is said to be protective. And in other areas, it's completely neutral. So you will see it, but it won't necessarily mean anything good or bad. It is just an event that happens. Some families have black dogs attached to them traditionally. This was the whole idea for the Hound of the Baskervilles in a lot of ways, of course. Mm-hmm. There are lots of different aspects to the black dog, and it can mean different things depending on where you are and what the nature of your experience is.
I see. So it's not as clear cut as I thought, obviously.
Not at all, no.
Have you had an experience yourself with a black dog?
I have not, no. I have spoken to lots of people who have, and I've recorded lots of stories from people who have, but I have not myself, as far as I know. And the reason that I say as far as I know is because I have had an experience with an animal that I could not identify in the landscape, but I believe that was an experience with a big cat, and that is quite different.
Very, very different. As I understand it, they actually caught one in your area.
They shot a lynx in my area in the 1990s, I think, on Dartmoor. They shot a lynx, but there's quite a lot of well-known recordings of big cats in this area. Certainly, I've seen enough evidence in front of me that I have no reason to doubt that there are plenty of them in the wild around this area. Whether I saw one on the day that I saw something or not, I can't say. It was too fleeting to identify for certain. There is a school of thought that says that sightings of black dogs, if you go back historically, are actually just misidentified big cat sightings, but that's not a theory that I think holds very much credence. You have to bear in mind with black dog sightings that actually the history of them is very, very long. So although people contact me and say that they've had an experience, and until recently when they started looking up about it, they thought their experience was unique and that they didn't know that other people had had similar things. Well, the earliest recorded sighting in my archive comes from 1127, so actually there's nearly 1,000 years of folklore to draw on. It's not, compared to a lot of other folklore traditions, I guess, as well known in many ways.
Is it more prevalent in a specific area, or is it more widespread? So does it sort of like condense down into the West Country, or is it just general everywhere?
It's generally everywhere. There are certainly counties where there are more traditions. There are counties where there are more stories recorded. In some cases, I would ask reasons for that. I think the folklore is particularly strong in some coastal areas because of the links with smugglers, for example. But I think really the areas in which we have lots of stories recorded historically has nothing to do with that, particularly because if we look at the 1959 article that Theo Brown published, for example, attempted to draw up a distribution map of sightings across the UK. There were about 250 sightings recorded on this map of the UK, and they were definitely concentrated in three areas. They were concentrated around the southwest, and they were concentrated around the north of England. and they were concentrated around kind of Somerset area. But the only reason that there were so many sightings on the map for those areas is that those are the areas in which the three people who did most of the collecting lived. And we didn't have the means of transmission of stories that we have now, so it's very easy for me to interview somebody in another country with a sighting if they want to talk to me about it, the same as I'm talking to you now, even though that you two are in Essex and I'm in Devon. That's quite easy.
Yeah.
If I wanted to talk to you whilst I'm doing this, I could message you on Facebook and I could ask you another question, and that's all very straightforward. Well, of course, in the 1950s and 60s, most of the stuff that I transcribed out of the archives was all sent in an envelope with a stamp on it. Or it was recorded at the local Women's Institute meeting down the road or whatever. So we find these concentrations of sightings in the older maps purely because that's where the collectors lived. The tradition, in fact, goes it goes all over the UK, but it goes much wider than that because obviously I referred to the Latin American examples earlier on. We have examples coming out of America quite happily as well. It's not, and France, it's not a UK phenomena, but it is most prevalent within the United Kingdom, within our folklore.
Is it possible that one of those reasons would be is that we are probably the originators of folklore story collection? I think it's quite a bigger field here than anywhere else. I think certainly across Europe, and of course America is not as old, so they can't go as far back. I mean, I've been working on a book on a similar lines on folklore to do with witchcraft in the UK particularly, and I found that the wealth of information that's out there is amazing, and there's not as great an equivalent in Europe in terms of things like the Folklore Society, those kind of organisations who were writing books and collecting over a long period of time, as you know, Mark. So I wonder if part of the reason why there's so many stories of them here is because we've been very good at collecting them. I don't know.
Well, I guess that we'll only find that out in some respects as collecting happens more in other countries. It's certainly the case that we know a lot more about the subject here because we have that history of collecting behind us. Now, whether we find over time that there are very, very good organisations now in America. The American Folklore Society is very well respected and has a really solid body of work behind it. And as they start to look more at American collection, and they go back and yes, you've not got so much of an immediate history, obviously, in the Americas. Well, you've got an immediate history, but you haven't got an older history to work on. But it's the same with Australia as well. David Waldron, who used to live in the UK many years ago and wrote a book on the Black Dog of Bungay in Suffolk, works with a lot of folklore now in Australia, and a lot of his work looks at the folklore from the indigenous cultures within Australia. So when you look at Aboriginal folklore, obviously you'll find a lot of stories to collect there. And I guess the same is true in America. When you start to look at the Native American folklore, you find similar tropes coming out of there as well. There's just a lot more work to do to collect as much material as we have in the UK, I think.
Sorry.
I was going to say that's probably why we have so many stories to draw on here is just that wealth of collecting. But other areas will do the same thing and catch it up.
I was going to say, actually, it'd be interesting to see if there is legends and stories of the black dog type phenomena in the native traditions of Native Americans or Australian Aboriginals as well. That would be particularly fascinating, I think, to see if it is a phenomenon that goes, say, deeper, if you like, into the more sort of the deeper cultures or older cultures as well. So that would be quite interesting.
Well, yes, and it inevitably will, because a lot of the folklore, when you look at dogs within the UK, we can trace it back to prehistoric times. Some of the elements of it, dogs were one of the very first animals to be domesticated within this country, and certainly, in the Mesolithic and Paleolithic times, we have examples of dogs being used in a domesticated fashion. So dogs are very important to humans within our culture and have been for so long that it's inevitable that we have this kind of folklore surrounding them.
On that note, sorry, Andy, to cut you off there. We've been talking for an hour, so I think it's only fair we give Mark a little breather and we take a quick break. So bear with us, guys. After the break, we're going to continue with this discussion with Mark. So bear with us just for a few moments.
You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
Join Kerry Greenaway and Jay Lynch for the Parasearch UK radio show as they share their paranormal news, views and reviews from the UK and the USA with the help of guests from both sides of the pond. Will they agree or agree to disagree? Find out every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, right here on Paramania Radio.
Welcome back. Tonight we are talking with the absolutely amazing Mark Norman. Now, before the break, we were talking about the black dog phenomenon, and whilst we were in the break, the lads kept on talking. So I'm going to throw Andy straight back into it to continue that train of thought, because they were talking about a Jungian link. I don't think I said that right. I do apologise.
I'll just carry on with it. I know Mark, we just very briefly spoke in the other break that Mark does cover this actually in his book, but I just threw out the idea that the black dog itself is almost like the shadow form of the domestic dog. I was saying before that domestic dogs are the first thing we domesticated, and it's been around for thousands and thousands of years. That almost like it's the dark side. I mean, the guys know I talk about this a lot, actually, but in the basis of Jungian analysis, you're talking about the shadow self, which is the other side of you. It's the negativity, the things you don't like about yourself, is the bit you're trying to get away from that's always part of you, hence it's the shadow. And the idea that the black dog itself might be almost the shadow personification of the dark side of the dog, if you like. But as Mark's saying, he's gone into this area in his book. So, Mark, if you want to just expand upon that.
Yeah, the Jungian psychology, I think, is important within this area. Where I have a little bit of I don't have an issue with that suggestion as such. I think that's perfectly valid, but it's only actually valid for some examples of the black dog. So if you take the shook as one of the two main types of black dog folklore. So the shook is ominous, it's dangerous to meet it, it's portentous. Absolutely, that is the archetype of the dog. No question about that at all. That's very, very valid. But if you look at the more general black dog, not which may be neutral, but also where it is protective, and there are many, many examples of within folklore and within history of lonely women or timid men who are walking home late at night through a forest or whatever, and are accompanied by a phantom dog, phantom in so much as it mysteriously disappears when they get to their destination. And within the tradition, the story says that they would have been attacked by these robbers that were hiding in the woods, blah, blah, blah. Where the dog is protective, and there are many examples where the dog is protective, that doesn't quite hold true in the same way because it's not an archetype. But where I think this idea of the ideas of Jung are particularly valid within black dog folklore is this idea that I said I referred to earlier about descriptors of the dog over time being very, very similar. Now, the earliest recorded sighting of a black dog if you want to use that term, it actually refers more to the legends of the Wild Hunt, but is equally as valid. Comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in 1127. And in that, if you use the translation of that piece in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in 1127, refers to the dogs as being black and big-eyed and loathsome. So we've got big-eyed in there. Mm-hmm. Now, that same piece from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, with the exception of my book and one article I saw on the web recently, generally tends to be represented with a different translation. And the translation that most people use of that particular passage from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is that the dogs were black with eyes like saucers and horrible. Now, it's exactly the same meaning, but that translation is incorrect, because if you look at the etymology of the word saucer, it comes into the English language in the 14th century. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was written in 1127, so that translation is incorrect, in fact. But what we find is happening there is that this description of eyes like saucers, which is a recurring theme within Black Dog reports, has been mapped backwards onto this translation. That's quite common. That's not unusual. But there are various descriptions of the dog. There are 6 key themes that we can examine, and I talk about them in the book, for example, but there are various descriptions which recur over time. The dog has eyes like saucers is one of them, for example. And I get reports sent to me. I had one in 2009, 2010, perhaps, something like that, from somebody who used these descriptions very, very easily. You know, you could go and you could look at their report, and you could look at a report from the 1950s, and it'd be very, very similar. And what's happening is that people are using these same descriptions without having any knowledge of the subject. So people will say, I thought my experience was unique. I had no idea that other people had seen a phantom black dog. But they've used the same descriptions. We were talking earlier about the way that symbolism is important and how that is decoded over time. Well, in the reports in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, people would say that the dog that they saw was as big as a calf, because they tend to be very large. Mm-hmm. And in modern reports, people will send me reports and say, the dog was as big as a wolf. Well, it's exactly the same meaning, but obviously big as a calf in the mid-20th century, you'd expect that. Lots of rural farming, there's quite a common comparator. These days, wolves come out of horror stories to do with lycanthropy, things like that. We think about that sort of thing a lot more. So they're using the same descriptor, but they're changing it slightly based on their culture. Yeah. But Jungian psychology argues for the collective consciousness hypothesis, this idea of a folk memory. And when you think about what I was referring to earlier on with the domestication of the dog, and this idea of the dog being man's best friend that you were referring to in other terms, then it's absolutely the case that the dog as a symbol is embedded within our mindset, our worldview, however you want to look at it. Now, the Jungian idea of a folk memory then says that you have an experience, and as well as drawing on the culture that is around you, you're drawing on this collective memory, this collective consciousness, this folk memory of things from your past. So you naturally describe your experience using things from around you. The dog is as big as a wolf, because that is common for these times. But also you're drawing on this kind of folk memory idea of previous black dog sightings that have happened in the past, and you're using these common themes, eyes as big as saucers, and they're naturally being used as recurring descriptions because you're drawing on this from some kind of folk memory. This is the argument that Jungian psychology uses. And I think in the case of the black dog, it's very, very strong as an argument for what is happening when you look at the evidence.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. With my background and my work, I would absolutely agree with you. Yes, it is that sort of collective unconscious folk memory idea and the archetypes as well. One of the things I would just quickly throw in, though, is that although Young explored a relatively small number of archetypes, he did say there were probably thousands of them. So the alternate versions of more than one kind of black dog archetype deep within us as well. There could be the black dog protector, as you were describing, the one walking beside the person that then disappears and they reach their destination. That could be that as well. I'm just racking my brain. I think there's something in the Teutonic mythology, Grimm's Teutonic mythology, that talks about that kind of storyline. Those that don't know, you've got the Grimm's fairy tales everyone knows about, but the Teutonic mythologies they wrote, which are far more fascinating and far harder to get hold of, unfortunately. And I've got a feeling there's a recurrence a couple of times of that kind of black dog protector mythology is in there. I mean, I'm just off the top of my head at the moment. I'm sure it's in there somewhere. I've come across it. But yeah, absolutely agree with everything you're saying there.
Yeah, you may well be right. There's certainly, if we look at the whole of Grimm's body of work, we see very, very many examples of folklore themes. Obviously, I'm not hugely familiar with the Teutonic ones, but I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't find that in there. Yeah.
I would absolutely recommend getting hold of those if you get a chance. Unfortunately, they're quite hard to get hold of. They're a 4-volume set of the Teutonic mythology, which is a lot of the mythology behind some of the fairy stories as well, and they go into a lot of that. And it's one of those things that, I'm sorry, we're going off track a little bit for a second, but it really annoys me that it's so easy to get hold of the Grimm's fairy tales, but the much more important material, the mythology stuff, is much harder. But it's just the way modern publishing goes, unfortunately. But there's definitely examples in there of that kind of thing, as a black dog as a protective force as well. I'm sure of it. I'll have another check, but yeah.
Okay, well, now I'd like to move on a little from the black dog phenomenon. The book is an incredible piece of work, so get hold of that if you're interested in the black dog. Excuse me. We've posted the link, as I said, in the chat room. That's no problem. Now, there's been a couple of references to fairy lore. Now, I understand you're also writing... I'm sorry, I want to move you on because we're running out of time already. Can you believe it? I want to move you on because you're actually writing a new book, aren't you, on Devon fairies? Am I right in thinking that?
Well, I've recently co-authored a chapter on Devon fairies for a new collection of folklore looking at fairies across the UK. I have kind of talked about the idea of expanding this into a full book. Time is not allowing that at the moment, although that is something that I would certainly, I think needs to be looked at. Now, I co-authored this chapter with a researcher called Joe Hickey Hall, who lives up in Bristol, and we co-wrote this chapter on Devon fairies for this anthology, which is supposed to be coming out this summer. So yes, we've certainly looked at that a lot. And Jo is a social historian, and she's been looking at people's modern fairy sightings and how they kind of relate to older fairy folklore. We cover that a little bit in this chapter, although we tend to look at the kind of trace the folklore of fairy lore within this county through from the early period to modern times. So we have examples from both ends of the spectrum. But yes, I have written on that subject too.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to talk to you, because that whole side of it absolutely fascinates me in regards to the West Country, because it's really steeped in that kind of history, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Particularly, I guess, in many ways across the border. It's very, very strong within the folklore and the traditions of Cornwall. And that's not an area that I looked at for this particular example. Somebody else was covering that area, but it does kind of stretch across into Devon. I live on the fringes of Dartmoor, which is the big national park in Devon that isn't Exmoor. And we find a lot of stories on Dartmoor looking at very, very common fairy themes. People refer to pixies a lot as well down here, or if you live down here, you'll call them piskies, but that's the nature of the etymology. But we find a lot of stories. But interestingly, going back to themes that we covered earlier on, of course, we find stories that are set down here that we can find across the UK. in a very, very similar way. So I cite one in this chapter, which is the story of the fairy ointment. And if you're not familiar with this story, what happens in a very, very condensed version is that on a stormy night, a local nurse, stroke midwife, stroke similar sort of person, somebody knocks on the door and says, "You must come and tend to my wife who is giving birth in this horrible stormy night," or whatever. The woman doesn't want to go. Eventually, she gets offered quite a large amount of money. She goes off with this person. And in the condensed version of this story, she ends up being taken to the fairy realm, where she has to assist with the birth of this fairy baby to what in some versions is a kind of royal family within the fairy realm. And in the course of this, she's given some ointment, which she has to use, and which ends up being kept in her pocket. And when she uses it on her own eyes, it enables her to see the fairy realm when she comes back to our world. And she anoints one of her eyes with this ointment. And eventually the fairies come back when they realise what's happened, take the ointment off her, and as a punishment, they blind her in that eye, so she can never see the fairy realm again. Now, that's obviously not an experience that you would look at and say, "Oh, that's something that necessarily actually happened." That is a traditional story within fairy lore. But if you look in Catherine Briggs' work across the UK, you find that story in Scotland in a very, very similar way, and you find it in various other places as well. So there are certainly very, very common traditions within fairy lore in this county that we'll find in other places throughout the UK as well.
And that's not just the UK, is it? It goes across the world again, doesn't it? It's just named something different.
Yes, absolutely. And there'll be variations in different countries, as you would expect, but there'll also be a lot of similarities in different countries too. Again, within the UK, it's a particularly strong piece of folklore, but you'll find it in very, very similar ways in other countries, just with their own cultural variations to it.
Is there the strong connection between Brittany and Cornwall? I understand Richard Clements again is in the chat room. He said there is a strong connection between Brittany and Cornwall. Is there a strong fairy lore in that part of France?
I'm not an expert on folklore within Brittany or France, but I would certainly not be surprised, because we do find extensions of black dog lore going into Brittany particularly, and into other areas of France, which are very, very similar to those that we find in the southwest and on the southern fringes of the UK. And I think it's probably the case that fairy lore within that area is going to be similar, because remember, you have to look at the way that stories are likely to not just be transmitted, but be taken from one place to another. So obviously, going back to what I was saying about Australia earlier on, we find stories there that are very, very similar to stories within British folklore because of the way that the colonisation of Australia happened in history. We find stories coming out of Africa in westernised countries where the folklore travels because of unfortunate areas of history like slavery, for example, where lots of people ended up going from one country to another country and either settling or being forced to settle. They would take their culture, their traditions, their stories with them, and they would get integrated into those countries. Now, if you look at Brittany and that kind of area of France, and you look at Cornwall, and the geographic proximity between those, it's quite natural that stories will travel between those two areas, because it would be natural that even back in early history, that was an area where it would have been easy for people to travel from one point to the other, and so these areas of culture would move across and be transmitted and relocate between the two.
Yeah, I can understand that. I can really, really understand that. Now, you've referenced a couple of times the wild hunt. Isn't this supposed to happen on specific occasions in specific areas?
Yes, it's not necessarily that it happens in specific times in a calendrical fashion, in the same way as some ghosts are reported to sort of come up every Christmas Eve or every New Year's Eve. Okay. We find that particularly with cock-stride ghosts, for example, that they're quite common on New Year's Eve. That's for those that don't know, that's ghosts that are allowed to return home from wherever they have been banished at the rate of one cock-stride a year. And that's normally a calendrical occurrence, so that New Year's Eve being a boundary time between 2 years, boundary states are very important within folklore. It's a liminal time. That's when these things would naturally occur. But within the Wild Hunt, the Teutonic mythology, it's not so much that it's calendrical, but it's more to do with it's more meteorological, perhaps. So it would relate to stormy nights, particularly in those kinds of wild times.
Oh, I see. I thought it was on. Like, I always had that perception that it was on set like times of the year. But
not especially.
not.
No, not especially.
No.
I think Mark is saying there quite rightly that it is probably linked more to do with strange weather phenomena than anything else. It was a kind of again folklore explanation for strange weather phenomenon, which is one of the things we talked about back at the beginning. How with our lack of scientific understanding in times of past, we would attribute stranger phenomenon to stranger causes, shall we say? But yeah,
and one of the most famous black dog stories is the one that comes out of Bungay Church in Suffolk, where there is a very, very bad storm, and that folklore possibly links to examples of ball lightning or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that the church? Just very briefly, about 18 months ago, I think it was, briefly mentioned on the One Show, talked about the black dog legend that they discovered buried close to a church was the bones or the remains of a very, very large dog. Do you remember that at all, Mark?
That is in my book.
It is. Oh, good.
If that is, I'm in some respects, I'm very, very thankful for this story. And I'll tell you for why. Because you're quite right. A large skeleton of a dog was unearthed on an archaeological dig in Leighton. I think it was Leiston. One of them, I can't remember. Nothing untoward about it. It was a large dog. It was probably a Newfoundland or a similar breed that grow to a very large size. It was probably the abbot of the monastery that they were investigating, I think, at the time. It would have belonged to him, probably. And I trace, in my book, the media transmission of this story from original local newspaper report to ridiculous internet meme. There's a prime example of this, and where it goes from a large dog being dug up on an archaeological dig to a hound of hell evidence discovered story.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of getting at, exactly.
The reason that I'm so thankful for this is because every kind of 6 months or so, this meme does the rounds again on Facebook. And I got so fed up with this piece of misinformation going around on Facebook that I wrote an article about it, which Folklore Thursday, the Twitter hashtag Folklore Thursday, published on their website. So now, every time this comes around, I can link everybody to my article on the website and suggest that they might want to buy the book and find out the true story of it.
I love that.
General speaking, the timing was good because it was around about the time the book was coming out. Because I was at the, Nigel Pearson launched his book. He did a little talk in Suffolk about 18 months ago.
The Devil's Plantation, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And we talked briefly about the black dog, and it had been on the news fairly recently, and it was mentioned that your book was coming out. So, sorry, excuse me, I lose my voice there for a second. So yeah,
yes, it was a good piece of timing, but I did not orchestrate it in the slightest.
I was going to say, Mark, do you have a degree in marketing? Because that was perfect.
I don't, but I did jump off the back of it and suggest that people might want to look at the actual story, because the actual story. What's really interesting about that story is the way that is a prime example of how folklore changes over time, and in this case a very short amount of time, by that story travelling from the local press to the national press to internet press like Yahoo News, and then across to other countries through the news agencies on the internet, and how the story developed over time and became more and more ridiculous by drawing in these various symbols from within folklore.
I still think that's a brilliant piece of marketing you did there. I hold my hands up to you in awe.
It serves its purpose.
Sorry.
I find I said it serves its purpose, certainly.
Very much so. Now, another thing that's incredibly apparent in the West Country is witchcraft.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It's not that it's necessarily more apparent here than in other places, and I think you could argue the toss with Pendle, for example, over that in many ways.
True.
But certainly there are very strong traditions of historic witchcraft practices within the southwest. Cornwall is very strong in this, and by witchcraft we're looking obviously at traditional witchcraft pathways. Yes. So in Cornwall that would be the Pellar, or which is this kind of Cornish term for this traditional wise woman, cunning man, healer, practitioner example. And we find a lot of that. Well, I mean, we still find a lot of it, of course. It's just represented in slightly different ways these days. But yes, there is a lot of history of traditional witchcraft practices within the southwest. Yeah.
And your lovely wife, I understand, has actually written a play.
She has. So my wife Tracy is an actress and also now a playwright as well. And she has written this play which is called Witch. It's unfortunately that it came out at roughly the same time as The Witch.
Oh, yes.
The New England folklore film. Completely different sort of thing. Now, Witch is based around this kind of traditional witchcraft, witch trial time in early modern England. The play itself is not particularly about witchcraft or witches per se. It is about the social history of the time that led to accusations of witchcraft. What it's more importantly about is about persecution and about why women particularly, but men in some cases, were persecuted or victimized as witches in early modern England. So it looks at a destitute woman in a village community who has an accusation of witchcraft brought against her by one of the male villagers. And it doesn't look at the trial, because everybody does that. What this looks at is the whole backstory as to how these unfortunate people were brought to these trial situations. So it looks at a local magistrate bringing together the accuser and the accused to look at the evidence and to try and work out whether or not this woman was guilty of something and what she was or wasn't guilty of. What makes the play unique is that everything that happens to the fictional characters within this play actually happened to people around here in history. So it is based on original depositions and witch trial transcripts from the Museum of Witchcraft archives down in Cornwall, particularly the case of a woman called Denis Gimmerton, who lived in Lyme Regis in Dorset. That is the most complete record of witchcraft trial depositions that exist within England. Even then, it's very, very scant. But everything that was recorded within those depositions, those events, and the events from other depositions and other witch trials in the early period, 1500s, 1600s, are kind of mapped onto the characters in Tracy's play. So all of the events have actually happened to people in the past, and that's what makes this such a different and such an important piece of work, is that it is giving a voice to these people who were persecuted for things in the past, which they were not necessarily guilty of, and in these more modern times, it gives those people a voice to be represented again. It's a very, very powerful piece of theatre. Off the back of it, it was written to perform a summer season in the Witchcraft Museum last year, which is what we did with it. But it got such kind of strong reviews, and so many other people wanted us to do things with it, that it's now going to be touring through this year to various places. We've done private performances for schools and for universities, because the themes of persecution are important within the education system at the moment for different reasons.
Yeah.
And also Tracy has been asked to write a book based on it now, which is going to look both at the development of this as a piece of theatre and how folklore and tradition can be used to educate in more modern times, but more importantly as well, looking at these original documents and these issues of persecution and what happened to people historically when witchcraft accusations were brought, and looking at how we've used all of that within this piece. Also, there is on the Circle of Spears website, so circleofspears.com is the website for our production company that are putting this on. There is an audio play version of it, which is available on CD or as a digital download for our website, but there's also an extract on there if people just want to go and have a little bit of a listen to part of the play and kind of see what it's like on there as well. But this has become quite a big project now. Tracy is doing a lot of work on it, so there is a website specifically for the play if people are interested, which is www.tracynormanswitch.com, and there is a Facebook and Twitter feed for the play as well, which if you search for Witch all in capitals, or for Tracy Norman's Witch, will be easy enough to find. And also on the Circle of Spears website, there's a blog about the play as well. So if you're interested in the themes of this and these witchcraft accusation pieces of history and the research that's going on into this at the moment, then Tracy is starting to produce a lot of information, which will be going onto her website as the play and the project develops over time, because it's starting now to go out to museums or to history events and conferences and things like that, and being performed in lots of different places.
Okay, so where can we? Is that on the Circle of Spears company website? Can we find where it will be appearing on there?
Yeah, if you, we will list it on there. There is a section for Witch specifically on circleofspears.com, but more importantly, if you follow Tracy's website, which is tracynormanswitch.com.
I'm just putting it in the chat room now, actually.
Yeah, then obviously, and also there's a Facebook page for it as well, and most of the in-depth news will be on Tracy's pages, so that's a good place to follow.
Fantastic. I'm going to make sure I watch that, because it's going to be, I think that's really, really important. It's not just the, like you say, the reasons why that happened is just or more important than the actual what happened after, if you know what I mean. Now, you're also part of the friendship of, now I'm going to say this right this time, lads, Boscastle Museum of Witchcraft. Is that, did I say it right this time?
That was very good.
Thank you.
You did.
I named it wrong earlier. I got told off.
We won't tell anybody. It's fine.
Okay, shh.
Among the committee of the Friends of the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Boscastle in Cornwall, but also I do a lot of work with Tracy and a colleague actually with the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, because that is where Tracy's play was originally developed for. and we do other events down there for them as well. So we've done Halloween ghost stories at the museum, and we've done other entertainments at Halloween. Tracy has done some work down there on one of their education days, looking at wool and the uses of wool and spinning within folklore and within witchcraft and magic. She's not a witchcraft practitioner herself, but she's interested in those areas. So we work quite closely on a number of projects with the museum, and I would encourage anybody and everybody to visit the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic, because it really is one of the country's most unusual and interesting collections of artifacts, arguably, and very, very important within its field, and has a massive research library attached to it as well.
Just want to throw in a little quick point there, Mark, you might know about. I was involved in the only ever overnight ghost investigation at Boscastle Museum back in about 2002.
Yes, they don't tend to do them now.
No, I know. I was quite surprised. It was back when Graham King was the owner, and a friend of mine who ran the group approached him, and he actually agreed. And it was like, wow, fantastic! So we had a very interesting night there. A lot of I've got audio recordings from them. A lot of sounds of footsteps and doors opening and closing in the parts of the museum where none of us were. Particularly when we were upstairs, a lot of the noises were coming from downstairs. And we went down to check, and there was nobody in sight. Graham actually left the building for the night, which was quite amazing as well. And so it's the only time I don't know it's ever been done there. I've been there a couple of times. It is a truly fantastic place. Well worth a visit if anyone's in the West Country. I'm going to the Cursing Conference in a couple of weeks' time there as well, which I'm quite looking forward to.
Well, so am I, so I'll see you there.
Oh, excellent. I'll see you there, definitely, yeah.
Well, so Circle of Spears will have a stall at the Cursing Conference, because we have a lot of... we produce audiobooks as well as doing theatre work, and a lot of the titles that we have... we've done some of Gemma Gary's traditional witchcraft books as audio, for example. So we have a lot of stuff that's kind of relevant to the themes of the conference. So I will be there too, and so will Tracy.
Excellent. Funny enough, I was just looking at the Circle of Spears site for the audiobooks. I've got the traditional witchcraft one that was done a while back. I didn't realise it's done the Black Toad as well now. So I shall. I was actually about to order it, but I will wait to the conference and pick up a copy from you personally then. When I'm there.
Well, yes, because Gemma will also be at the conference and she can sign it for you. There you go.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, we're doing a conference ourselves in September, and Gemma is one of the speakers there at that, the Witchcraft Conference down in the southeast. It's all kind of based around southeast stuff mainly. So. But so she's going to come along to that too, so that'd be good.
Gemma is a fascinating lady who really has had her arm very forcibly twisted to speak at public events lately, because it's not something that she's done a lot of. But it's good that she's coming, because she is really, really interesting.
Yeah, we were really pleased that she agreed to come to ours in September, as I say. I was rather pleased about it, to say the least. And I was going to say something else that got out of my head completely. It's just gone. It's just poof, disappeared. There was something I was going to say, but I've forgotten. That doesn't matter, never mind. But yeah, sorry, Kerry, carry on.
That's okay, it's your age. That's all I'm going to say.
I know. A long day. Been a long day.
Now, on the spiritual circuit, I have to say, Boscastle Museum of Witchcraft is always one that people almost like say, you've got to go to. So it's on... I keep talking about my bucket list. My bucket list gets bigger every time I speak to somebody. But that place is definitely on my list. I can't wait to visit. Do you think, Mark, there is any chance that we could possibly get in there for a little investigation?
I think it would probably be not as likely as it used to be.
No,
they don't tend to let people in there outside of hours anymore like they used to. So there is no harm in talking to them, certainly.
Well, I might have to put on my loveliest voice and do some talking then, yeah?
Yeah, well, there's never any harm in asking.
Unfortunately, Kerry, many have tried since our little investigation. Now, we didn't do anything wrong. We didn't leave a mess. We didn't make any problems at all. But I just think it was a one-off experiment, which it's never been repeated. So I don't think it's ever going to get repeated now. Because I know it's no longer owned by the one person, is it, Mark? It's part of a larger organisation, I think, if I'm right.
It's owned, if that's the right word, by Simon Costin of the Museum of British Folklore.
Oh, that's it.
It has its own husband and wife team of managers, Peter and Judith, who live at the museum and who manage it on a day-to-day basis. But it comes under the auspices now of the Museum of British Folklore. And for anybody who visited when Graham had it and hasn't visited since, they'll notice some very, very significant changes between the time that Graham was there and how it's set out now. So it now has an area for rotating exhibitions. So they have a main exhibition which changes every year now in the bottom of the museum. This year's is obviously on cursing, hence the cursing conference that you were talking about. And a lot of artifacts that have come in recently, and a lot of new displays, and is forging some really, really strong links. There are some artifacts from the museum being lent to the British Library for their Harry Potter exhibition this year.
Oh, brilliant!
There are some artifacts from the museum, I think, at the V&A at the moment, and I think the British Museum are borrowing a couple for other exhibitions as well. So it's forging some really, really strong links within the museum sector, which is just great news.
Yeah, it's very, very
Absolutely.
good news, that is.
Yeah, I've not been since Graham left, so I'm looking forward to having a good look around at the changes, definitely.
Oh, you'll love it.
So definitely worth a visit, guys. So if you are ever down that way, I would definitely recommend that one. Now, one thing I was going to ask you, Mark, is with all your knowledge and everything you know about in regards to fairy lore and elementals and witchcraft, have you ever tried anything? Have you ever done anything practical? Have you ever had a go?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
Do you know what? I'm really, really bad at it. I'm about as esoteric as a plank. I understand a lot of the concepts and I know a lot of the background and all these sorts of things, and I have very, very high regard and very high respect for people who follow all of these different pathways within these areas. You said about your work with Chris on. I know lots of people through my work with the museum who follow lots and lots of different pathways within various religions or various non-religious worldviews, and I have nothing but the highest regard for what they do and for what they achieve, but I'm really bad at all of it.
Well, the saying really is about how to get to Carnegie Hall. It's practice, practice, practice. Just keep trying stuff. Yeah. Eventually stuff works.
Absolutely.
In my experience, it's all about how strong your intention and your will is.
Well,
there are many factors, aren't there? There are many factors. That's certainly true. I've done a lot of paranormal investigation in my time, and I've seen a lot of very interesting things and seen a lot of potentially interesting results. Mm-hmm. But they don't happen around me.
Oh, bless
you. What sort of thing have you experienced or seen on a paranormal investigation then, Mark?
Oh, I mean, I've seen interesting. I've seen interesting audio. That's a really, really bad way of describing it. I've had some very, very interesting auditory phenomena recorded on investigations. I've seen people pick up on a lot of different feelings in rooms and pick up on various things that kind of tie in with other stuff that's happened there before. I mean, I would say arguably that we have a lot of experiences within my own house, because my house is quite old. And we've certainly had quite a number of odd smells within the house, like your traditional kind of cigarette smoke type smells, which in in and of themselves are quite interesting, but then when people like the guy who came a few years ago to fit our kitchen report them to you completely independently, in so much with his that he actually stopped work because he thought that he'd set fire to something, whereas in fact it was just the smell of our house that comes from time to time. Tracy's had one or two experiences of auditory phenomena within our own house, so I mean, I'd argue that stuff happens near me, but my involvement in it is not normally very strong.
Okay.
Well, you manifest things in other ways, like your writing and your podcasting. Talking about your podcasting, I'm going to say the link again. It's www.thefolklorepodcast.com. Now, your latest podcast was on fraudulent Victorians and mediums.
Yes, it was. Yes.
Regarding the SPO, you talked about Arthur Conan Doyle and Harry Price quite a bit.
Yes, I did. That podcast came out of a talk that I gave at the Folklore Society a couple of years ago. The Folklore Society did a conference. They do a conference every September, like a mini conference, which looks at one element of day-to-day world from a folkloric angle. So, for example, that particular conference was about legends and traditions and the law. They've done animals in legend and tradition. They've done food in legend and tradition, and so on. This one was about the law, and my paper at that looked at examples of mediumship and séance room activities within Victorian times when spiritualism was in its heyday, which were proven within law to be fraudulent, and kind of how that came about, some of the mechanisms that charlatans used within the séance room environment to create these effects, how they were prosecuted within the law, and it also the podcast looks a little bit at the kind of the history of the legal system that led up to these events happening.
Yeah, I found it absolutely fascinating, I have to say, because I knew roughly a little bit about the legal side of it, not a huge amount. I know that now any medium or, that kind of work has to state it's for entertainment purposes only.
Yes, I do.
But I didn't realise how far back that went. So could you tell me a little bit about that quickly? I know you want people to listen to your podcast, but can you just give me a little brief overview for our listeners, please?
Well, what I looked at there really started out. It gave a bit of a brief overview of the history. So it went back to kind of the Tudor period, for example, and looked at the original laws that came about in that time, and they were very much to do with divination at that time and to do with fortune telling. So the laws at that time would refer to Egyptians, for example, and by Egyptians it's not referring to that particular class of person. It's referring to this idea of a fortune teller or a divinator, diviner. I think I just invented a new word there.
We'll allow you that.
Thanks. I should write to the Oxford English Dictionary immediately after this programme and suggest that they put it in. So the law at that time was very much looking at this idea of divination and fortune telling, and then as time went on, it started to look at the work of claims of divining through the spirit realm. But what I particularly focus on in this, and I make the point very clearly at the start of this podcast again, is that I am not looking at whether or not mediums are charlatans or are practicing something that is a genuine ability, because some people will undoubtedly be fraudulent, because human beings at the end of the day can be a bit of a git from time to time, and you will have people who will exploit other people. That is just the way of the world. But again, that's not my area of focus. I'm not looking at that. Yes, what I'm looking at in this particular example is where these people were fraudulent and where they were exploiting other people through the séance room or through claims of being able to talk to the spirit world. Why were they doing it? So there are one or two examples in there where they were obviously doing it because they had a way to be able to con an awful lot of money out of people by telling them what they wanted to hear, essentially. So it looks at this kind of the development of spiritualism against this backdrop of con artists and fraudsters, and how those people were brought to book, and the techniques and the mechanisms that they used to be able to produce these effects within particularly the seance room environment. So I'm very, very clear within this, as I am with all of my episodes that deal with subjects that can be very contentious in so much as people have strong feelings one way or the other. I think, and if I'm wrong in this, then I apologise to anybody that I am wrong about it. But I think it's fair to say that I don't offer anything up in any of my pieces of work which suggests one thing or the other. It talks about different areas within folklore, within our social history, where these events take place, and the fact that in some cases it looks at events that may well have a lot of grounding in the paranormal or in some kind of supernatural event, and some of them might be more superstitious or in some cases downright fraudulent, like the last one. But it just looks at the evidence as to what is happening here, and how people are affected by it, and how it fits into our culture and into our social history. So it really just is examining a cross-section of different areas of our folklore, and how they affect people and how they come about.
I actually agree with you. I've listened to quite a few of your podcasts, and you come across incredibly well. You put the information out there, you put the stories out there, and it's, from my perspective, I work in the paranormal field but also work in the spiritual field, it's really nice to have that balance and an unobjective view on some of the stories that you hear, that you're able to go, okay, so that's part of this, that we can draw on that as, like you say, a social understanding. But we can now take that and maybe go forward and see what we can find in regards to paranormal investigating, and seeing if we can get anything, whether it's from a young, however you say his name. I'm so sorry, Andy. I say it wrong every time. Point of view, or whether or not it is an actual phenomenon or whatever it is. But that's why folklore is so important. And, we've covered this quite a lot. Andy?
Yes.
Anything you want to say at this point?
I very much agree. I think it is important, as Mark has said previously, that folklorists themselves don't necessarily offer a particular opinion. You're the cataloguer, if you like, the interpreter, but not definitively stating it one way or t'other. I mean, as you know, I'm probably the sceptical side of things these days. I believe I've experienced stuff and I've dealt with things, but I'm more sceptical. So I always like to see a good balance. Often things are reported, as you said before, with the Satan dog from hell invading the church story that was going around. It's a sensationalism that so often is remembered, rather than the facts behind or the information behind the stories that are often gets lost. And that's important, that people do have somewhere to go for the more balanced perspective, the more, these are the facts, decide for yourself what you think. This is what we've discovered, this is how it's presented itself. We're not going to conclude anything from it, just what do you feel? I like that approach, definitely.
Absolutely, and that is my role as a folklorist. That is my role when I'm looking at these stories and analysing what's going on. But more importantly, it's my role as a recorder of these traditions and of these experiences. And I think what I try to present through the podcast episodes is a kind of potted history, I guess, of each of these different motifs or tropes within folklore, with some experiences where I can draw them from from people's own lives, and also going back and looking at what's been recorded throughout history. So it's kind of a drawing together in 40, 45 minutes, whatever each show comes out at, of this particular area. And hopefully, yes, it gives enough background that people can, if they engage with that topic, look into it some more, or it might inform their own day-to-day lives in some way, and they go, well, hang on a minute, that kind of relates to something that happened to me, and then they can go into it that way. That's kind of the purpose of it.
Absolutely, yeah. It is very well done, I have to say, yes.
I agree. One last thing before we start wrapping the show up is, have you ever had a mediumistic reading yourself, Mark?
I have not had a very in-depth mediumistic reading. No, I've had people who practice a number of different skills within that area who have sort of made little suggestions, bits and pieces here and there. But I haven't had a full reading from any of the different practitioners that do it in different ways. That's
very interesting. I would have thought you would have had a go.
No, I haven't, and not for any particular reason, one way or the other. It's just something that I haven't done, and not because I'm looking to see how accurate people are. You know, I enjoy it when people offer up these things that kind of go, oh yeah, do you know what, that ties in with such and such thing. I like that. That's good, but I haven't actively sought one out.
Okay, no worries. Now, Mark, if people wish to find you, we've mentioned your podcasting website quite a bit, but where else can they find you?
Well, my main focus, I guess, for people to find my work and to engage with what I do is through either of my social media channels that are not the Folklore podcast. So, I mean, the Folklore podcast has its own social media channels. Mm-hmm. My main research page on Facebook is probably the best one. So it's facebook.com/Mark Norman Folklore. That's the biggest community that kind of what I do. I think, I don't know how many people follow it. It's just over 2,000 the last time I looked. It's quite a big community. And they can also find me on Twitter at Mr_Mark_Norman. So either of those are easy places to follow what I do. And I'm always more than happy for people to drop me a message on either of those channels if they want to know something or want to talk about something, and get in touch with me that way.
That's fantastic. Now, just to reiterate, it's www.thefolklorepodcast.com. All of Mark's episodes are on there, up to date, and he covers so many different subjects. And please go over and have a listen, because there is so much information and he's absolutely fascinating. And as you can tell, he knows his subject incredibly well. I'm going to just tell you...
We can tell you're a big fan there.
I know, I am. I'm a huge fan. I am an absolute huge fan. And I'm also going to tell you again about Tracy's play. Check out www.tracynormanswitch.com. This is regarding Mark's wife's play. Or check out the Circle of Spears Company for all the information on that play as well. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem at all. Now, you can catch this episode on podcast if you've missed it, which I know you haven't because you've all been listening intently, I can tell. We're on Podbean. We're on the Internet Archive. We're on YouTube. Where else are we on, Andy? We're on Tumblr. We're on Facebook ourselves, obviously.
And you've covered them all, actually.
Have I covered them all? Now, this week we have got an absolute fantastic shows lined up. They go live every night at 9 p.m. On Mondays we have the Paranormal Hindsight with Jay and Teresa. On Tuesday night we have Paul Rook with his Paranormal Concept show. On Wednesdays, we have Haunted Histories with Penny Morgan. Then on Thursdays, we have Seventh Sanctum with Kerry and Carter. On Fridays, we have the Great Paranormal Debate, followed by the Dark Mirror Show. And then on Saturdays, we have the brand new... Tell me, Andy, is it
KTPF Reload Show, the old shows on the KTPF internet station I used to be involved in a few years ago that unfortunately closed down a while back. I am recreating I'm taking the interviews of all the various guests out and making little shows of them, which go out on Saturday nights for people to have a listen to.
That's right. So, guys, catch us every night of the week. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark. Thank you for joining us, Andy. Say good night, guys.
Mark first.
Good night. Thank you. I'm happy to come back anytime if you want me to waffle on some more to you.
Oh, that would be absolutely awesome. We'll definitely take you up on that offer.
I
Andy?
think so. Yes, and it's good night for me, guys, and hopefully we'll see you in the week.
And it's good night from me. Thank you for joining us.
You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.